At 11:40 p.m. on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll C. Smith hunkered down in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at McGuire Field on Muro Island, his gloved hands gripping the control column as his radar operator tracked a contact moving at 180 knots through the inky black skies north of the Philippine Islands. At 26 years old, Smith had 43 combat missions under his belt and 4 confirmed aerial kills to his name, each one etched into his memory as a testament to skill and survival. That night, the Japanese had launched 12 bombers tasked with destroying American airfields, and Smith was intimately familiar with their tactics, having studied their nightly raids with a meticulous eye. For 2 consecutive weeks, Japanese bombers had descended on Muro each night without fail, triggering a staggering 334 air raid alerts in just 14 days, keeping troops and engineers on edge around the clock. American engineers were racing against time to construct 2 airfields to support the impending Lingayen Gulf invasion, their hands calloused from endless labor as they worked day and night to lay down runways. The Japanese High Command recognized the critical role these sites would play in turning the tide of the Pacific Campaign. If U.S. fighters could operate from Muro, they would provide unbroken air cover for the entire invasion force, shielding troops from aerial attacks as they stormed the beaches. Determined to halt construction at all costs, the Japanese deployed every aerial asset at their disposal: conventional bombers, suicide kamikazes, and any repurposed aircraft capable of carrying explosives. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron, to which Smith belonged, had arrived at Muro 3 days earlier, on December 26th, their P-61s still bearing the dust of their long journey. Now his small squadron was the sole barrier between those relentless Japanese bombers and the 20,000 American troops sleeping in flimsy tents below, unaware of how close danger loomed. The pressure was suffocating, a tangible weight pressing down on Smith as he waited for the order to engage. Every bomber that evaded interception would mean dead engineers, fallen construction crews, delayed airfield completion, a postponed invasion, and countless more American casualties at Lingayen Gulf, losses he was determined to prevent. Smith's P-61 was unlike any aircraft the Japanese had encountered, a marvel of wartime engineering built for the sole purpose of dominating the night. Designed by Northrop specifically for night combat, the Black Widow was the first U.S. warplane crafted exclusively for that high-stakes mission. With a 66-foot wingspan and 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, each generating 2,000 horsepower, it boasted a top speed of 366 miles per hour, enough to outpace most enemy bombers. But its most lethal feature wasn't the 420mm cannons mounted in its belly, capable of tearing through metal and fuel tanks with ease. It was the SCR-720 radar housed in its nose, a secret weapon that would rewrite the rules of night warfare. This radar could detect enemy aircraft up to 5 miles away in total darkness, a technology the Japanese knew nothing about. They relied on the night to conceal their bombers, believing darkness rendered them invisible. They were tragically wrong. Behind Smith, in a separate compartment, Lieutenant Philip Porter, his radar operator with 6 months of target tracking experience, monitored a glowing screen that displayed every aircraft within range. Porter knew how to read the scope, guide Smith toward contacts, and differentiate friendly planes from enemy bombers. The predicament was brutal and unforgiving. One lone P-61 pitted against 12 Japanese bombers, each intent on reducing the airfields to rubble. If Smith engaged one target, 11 others would slip through the gap to bomb the vulnerable construction sites and troop encampments. The math was cold and cruel. Even if he managed to shoot down 3 or 4 bombers, the rest would complete their deadly mission, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake and derailing the entire invasion timeline. Smith had trained for this exact moment for 18 long months, enduring grueling night fighter drills at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida, mastering complex radar intercept procedures, navigating by instruments alone in pitch darkness, and practicing gunnery until his hands remembered the feel of the trigger without looking. The training was exhaustive because night combat was the most dangerous form of aerial warfare. No visual landmarks to guide him, no horizon to gauge altitude, only flickering instruments, faint radar blips, and the gnawing fear that the target being tracked might be a friendly pilot. The 418th had flown its first combat mission in November 1943, operating from primitive airfields in New Guinea with P-70 Havocs before transitioning to modified P-38 Lightnings, equipped with experimental radar. The P-61ES arrived in September 1944, and they revolutionized night combat. Stable, forgiving, and powerful, with radar that functioned reliably. But even this cutting-edge technology couldn't solve Smith's problem that night. 12 bombers were closing in, and his fuel would last only about 3 hours. If he spent 10 minutes engaging each target, he could intercept just 3 before needing to return to base, leaving 9 to unleash chaos. 9 bombers could mean hundreds, if not thousands, of casualties, especially if they struck fuel dumps or ammunition depots. At 11:42 p.m., Porter's voice crackled over the intercom. He had 4 distinct contacts on the scope, all heading south toward Muro at different altitudes. Smith faced a critical choice: which bomber to pursue first, and whether his plan to take down all 4 in one night was an act of genius or suicide. He pushed the throttles forward, and the twin R-2800 engines roared to life, lifting the Black Widow at a rate of 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out directions: heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Through the canopy, Smith saw nothing but impenetrable blackness. No moon, no stars, just heavy clouds blanketing the sky. This was why the Japanese had chosen tonight: complete darkness that left conventional fighters blind. But Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar relied on a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the P-61's nose, emitting microwave pulses 180 degrees forward. When these pulses struck an aircraft, they bounced back, appearing as a glowing blip on the radar operator's scope. The scope featured 2 displays, one showing azimuth, left or right of the aircraft's nose, and the other elevation, above or below. Porter monitored both simultaneously, guiding Smith toward the target with verbal corrections. Left 5 degrees, down 3 degrees. The system worked because Porter was exceptional at his job. At 3 miles out, Smith activated his own radar scope, a smaller display integrated into the main instrument panel. Once the target drew near enough, he could track it independently, no longer relying on Porter's verbal cues. Smith's scope was simpler than Porter's, showing only range and relative position, but it was sufficient. The enemy target was a Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Americans as the Betty, a bomber with 2 2,000-horsepower Mitsubishi engines, a top speed of 270 miles per hour, a crew of 7, and a 1,760-pound bomb load. The Betty had a fatal flaw: no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst from Smith's cannons would turn it into a fireball. At 2 miles out, Smith locked firmly onto the Betty on his scope, the blip steady and clear as it cut through the night. The bomber crew remained completely oblivious to his presence. Japanese bombers lacked even basic tail warning radar, leaving them defenseless against pursuing night fighters. They flew on in the darkness, lulled into a false sense of security by the blackness that surrounded them, confident their cover would hold. The P-61's sleek black paint job made it nearly undetectable against the night sky, and its engines hummed more quietly than most Allied fighters, a design feature tailored for stealth. The Japanese had already dubbed it the Black Widow after encountering it in scattered skirmishes, a name born of fear, but fear only held power if they knew the Widow was hunting them. Smith closed to 1,000 yards, still unable to see the Betty visually through the oppressive darkness. The sky was a void, no hint of moonlight or starlight to pierce the clouds, leaving him to rely entirely on his radar scope as the blip grew larger and more defined with each passing second. 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, he finally spotted it, a faint, dark silhouette against the slightly lighter backdrop of the cloud layer, barely distinguishable from the night itself. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible, faint orange glows from the engine nacelles that flickered like dying embers. Smith carefully positioned the P-61 slightly below and behind the Betty, aligning his aircraft for the kill with the precision of a marksman. The 4 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were fixed in the lower fuselage, requiring Smith to aim the entire aircraft using the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel, which projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass, guiding his aim with pinpoint accuracy. At 400 yards, Smith armed the cannons, each holding 200 rounds, 800 total, enough for roughly 40 seconds of sustained fire. But night fighter doctrine dictated short, concentrated bursts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill, and move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on one bomber would leave him short-handed for the rest. At 350 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The four cannons fired in unison, their roar deafening even over the engine noise. 20-millimeter high-explosive shells streaked toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second, tracers cutting red lines through the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds, 12 rounds per cannon, 48 total. The Betty's right wing exploded, fuel igniting instantly. The bomber rolled right and plunged into a steep dive, illuminating the clouds below as it fell. It crashed into the water 8 miles north of Muro at 11:57 p.m. One bomber down, 11 remaining, but Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd burned 15% of his fuel, and 3 more contacts lingered on Porter's scope, all heading toward the airfields, separated by miles of black sky. He had just 112 minutes of fuel left. Porter identified the second target at 12:14 a.m. on December 30, heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended, confronting a geometric challenge. The second bomber was 23 miles from his first kill. The P-61 cruised at 280 miles per hour, meaning a roughly 5-minute intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent closing in on Muro, the airfields, and its mission objective. Smith pushed the Black Widow to 320 miles per hour, knowing the R-2800 engines consume fuel at an alarming rate at high power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. But if he failed to intercept quickly, the bomber would reach the target zone, prompting American anti-aircraft gunners to open fire. The bomber might be shot down, or it might release its bombs. Either way, Smith would have failed. Night interception was a numbers game. Most missions ended without contact, the vastness of the sky making even radar-assisted searches a challenge. The 418 had scored just 18 kills in 14 months. Smith already had 4. Adding 4 more in one night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the war. But records didn't matter. Stopping the bombers did. Porter called out corrections as Smith adjusted his heading, the second contact growing stronger on the scope. At 1 mile, he spotted another Betty. Same profile, same vulnerable fuel tanks. This one flew lower, 6,000 feet instead of 8,000, closer to the cloud layer, limiting his maneuvering room. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind, his approach needing perfection. Too fast and he'd overshoot, too slow and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters thrived on surprise. Once the enemy knew he was there, the crew would take evasive action, gunners would open fire, and the clean intercept would devolve into a dogfight. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly, a dark shape against the night sky, flying straight and level, no sign of detecting him. He centered the target in his gun sight and fired a 2-second burst at 350 yards, 48 rounds tearing through the fuselage. The Betty's right engine caught fire instantly, followed by the left, both wings ablaze within seconds. It nosed over and dove toward the ocean, crashing at 12:19 a.m. 2 bombers down, 10 remaining, but Smith's fuel gauge showed 42% left. Porter had 2 more contacts, both closer to Muro than the previous targets, at 9,000 and 4,000 feet, 8 miles apart. Smith chose the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than rapid descent, though it let the lower bomber draw closer to the airfields. A wrong choice would let 1 bomber slip through, dooming the mission. Smith turned north and climbed, reaching 9,000 feet at 12:23 a.m. Porter locked onto the third contact, range 7 miles heading 160, speed 190 knots. This one was different, faster than the Betty in executing evasive maneuvers, turning and changing altitude. Someone on board knew American night fighters were in the area. It was a Nakajima Key 49, codenamed Helen by the Americans. Faster, 306 miles per hour top speed, better armed with 7.7mm machine guns and a tail gunner with a clear rear field of fire. Approaching directly from behind would put Smith in the gunner's sights, so he adjusted his approach, coming from below and left. The bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage, a weakness Smith exploited. The Helen continued its erratic, evasive tactics, weaving left and right, climbing 200 feet, then descending 300 in a desperate bid to shake off any pursuer. Its pilot clearly experienced, knowing full well that straight and level flight made it an easy target for night fighters. Porter compensated by closely monitoring the scope, predicting the bomber's movements and reading its pattern to anticipate each turn, his voice steady as he relayed adjustments to Smith. Smith closed to 600 yards just as the Helen made a sharp right turn. He followed smoothly, the P-61's twin-boom design granting it exceptional stability even at high speeds. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner suddenly opened fire, tracers streaking past the canopy like red lightning, a stark reminder that surprise was now gone. Smith had mere seconds to take his shot before the pilot initiated more aggressive evasion, so he squeezed the trigger for 3 seconds. 72 rounds punching through the fuselage with devastating force. The right engine exploded in a ball of fire, the bomber rolling inverted and spinning downward in a chaotic descent. Smith pulled away sharply to avoid debris, watching as the burning aircraft plummeted into the water at 12:29 a.m. 3 down, 9 remaining, and his fuel gauge showed just 28%, a critical level as most pilots returned to base at 30% to avoid the deadly risk of running out of fuel over open ocean, a virtual death sentence in the unforgiving darkness. Porter's scope flickered with one final contact, the fourth target, heading 170 degrees, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. The low-altitude bomber Smith had made the difficult choice to bypass earlier. It was now just 12 miles from Muro, close enough that Smith could see the faint glow of American searchlights sweeping the dark sky like giant fingers, and the silhouette of anti-aircraft batteries standing at the ready, gunners' fingers hovering over triggers. He descended toward it rapidly, diving to conserve precious fuel, his eyes fixed on the radar blip as he leveled off at 4,200 feet. Slightly above the target, a strategic position that let him leverage gravity for a faster attack, reducing the bomber's window to react. At 1 mile, he spotted the outline of another Betty, flying straight and true toward Muro, with no hint of evasive action. Its pilot either unaware of the American night fighters patrolling the skies or so committed to his mission that he prioritized it over his own survival, a mindset that defined many Japanese bomber crews in the later stages of the war. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind at 350 yards, checking his ammunition counter. 512 rounds left, enough for 3 or 4 more bursts. His fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. 1 chance, 1 burst, then he had to return. At 12:34 a.m., he fired a 2-second burst, 48 rounds converging on the Betty's center fuselage. The port wings separated, fuel tanks ruptured, and fire consumed the remaining wing structure. The bomber rolled left and dove, crashing into the ocean at 12:35 a.m. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned back toward Muro, fuel at 21%. McGuire Field was 18 miles south, with roughly 60 gallons remaining, enough for 36 minutes of cruise flight, barring disaster. Porter scanned for additional contacts. None. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back, whether spooked by Smith's attacks or losing nerve. The mission was a success. 4 kills, 0 American casualties, airfields safe, construction crews working uninterrupted, and the Lingayen Gulf invasion on schedule. But Smith's night wasn't over. At 12:42 a.m., Porter detected a new contact heading north, 4 miles away, 7,000 feet altitude, between Smith and base, 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. If it was a bomber, it threatened the airfields he'd just defended. Engaging would burn more fuel, risking a forced landing, but letting it pass would taint his night's work if it killed Americans. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter guided him in, the range closing rapidly. At 800 yards, Smith saw it wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki 84 Hayate, codenamed Frank, a single-engine fighter, one of Japan's best, with a top speed of 392 miles per hour, four 12.7mm machine guns, and two 20mm cannons. Faster, more maneuverable, and with a better climb rate than the P-61 in daylight, but at night it lacked radar, flying blind. Smith's advantage was surprise. He positioned the P-61 below and behind at 500 yards using the same bomber intercept tactic. Get close, fire, confirm. Fighters were smaller, harder to hit, and armored. 2 seconds might not be enough. He closed to 300 yards, fuel at 17%. One shot, no second chances. At 12:45 a.m., Smith squeezed the trigger for 3 seconds, 72 rounds tearing through the Frank's tail and engine cowling. The engine erupted in flames, black smoke pouring out. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched as the pilot ejected at 3,000 feet, a white parachute against the black sky. The Frank crashed into the water at 12:46 a.m., Smith's fifth kill of the night. His fuel gauge showed 15%, 11 miles from base, 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough with minimal reserves. Porter guided him to Muro via radar, the island appearing as a large landmass on the scope. McGuire Field on the southwestern coast, operational for just 4 days, lit by a single row of kerosene lamps marking the 5,000-foot crushed coral runway. No instrument landing system, no overrun area, no crash barriers. Smith descended to 2,000 feet, fuel at 13%, 84 gallons, 18 minutes. At 12:52 a.m., he spotted the 12 dim runway lamps 8 miles out, 1.7 minutes to the landing pattern at 280 miles per hour, barely enough fuel. At 12:55 a.m., disaster struck. The runway lights went out, all 12 extinguishing simultaneously. Smith was 3 miles out, 800 feet altitude, 140 knots. No visual reference for landing. Porter suggested the radar altimeter, which measured height above ground via radio waves, accurate to 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning, touching down when it read 0, dangerous as navigation errors meant crashing into jungle, reefs, or equipment. Fuel was 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes. No time to divert to the nearest alternative airfield, 90 miles away. He'd run out 40 miles short. Smith turned toward his estimated runway position, 600 feet altitude, fuel at 9%. He descended to 400 feet, radar altimeter showing 380 feet, reducing speed to 120 knots, 25 knots above stall speed with full flaps. Porter monitored the scope, confirming the coastline. McGuire Field was 1 mile inland. Smith approached from the north on heading 180 degrees, relying on his compass. At 12:58 a.m., he extended the landing gear. 3 green lights confirming it was down and locked. Fuel was 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes. He extended full flaps, slowing to 110 knots, descending at 300 feet per minute. At 100 feet, he reduced power, increasing descent to 400 feet per minute to save fuel. At 25 feet, he braced for touchdown. The P-61's main wheels hit the crushed coral runway at 12:59 a.m. The impact harder than normal as the aircraft jolted, but the sturdy landing gear held firm against the rough surface. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later, and Smith applied the brakes firmly, feeling the aircraft decelerate rapidly as it kicked up clouds of coral dust. 100 knots, 80, 60, 40, until it slowed to a crawl at 20 knots. Unable to see his surroundings in the pitch black, he kept the brakes applied until the P-61 came to a complete stop. His fuel gauge now showing just 6%, 29 gallons, barely 3 minutes of flight time left. Within minutes, ground crew members arrived with flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness to guide Smith to the parking area, their voices a welcome sound after the tension of the night. The engine sputtered to a halt at 1:03 a.m., exactly 63 minutes after takeoff, marking the end of one of the most extraordinary nights in aerial combat history. Smith climbed out of the cockpit, his legs stiff from hours of cramped sitting and his hands shaking. Not from fear, but from the physical and mental exhaustion of 5 intense intercepts, 5 kills, and a harrowing blind landing, all accomplished in less than an hour. Porter joined him moments later, the two men exchanging a silent nod of mutual respect. Night fighting was a team effort, and Porter's precision tracking had made every kill possible. Ground crew inspected the P-61. No damage, all cannons functional, 408 rounds expended, 392 remaining. Intelligence officers arrived at 1:15 a.m., collecting details. 4 Bettys, 1 Helen, 1 Frank, destroyed between 11:57 p.m. and 12:46 a.m., confirmed by ground radar, coast watchers, and dawn wreckage sightings. 4 kills in one night tied the American night fighter record, but Smith wasn't done. At 2:30 p.m. on December 30th, he flew a second mission. Japanese reconnaissance fighters spotted over Muro. He and Porter took the same P-61, refueled and rearmed. At 3:12 p.m., Porter detected a Frank at 12,000 feet, 8 miles out. Smith climbed, diving to 390 miles per hour, faster than the Frank's level speed, firing a 2-second burst at 400 yards. The Frank's engine exploded, crashing into the ocean. Smith's 7th kill, making him America's top night fighter ace of World War II, a record no other pilot matched. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued its operations from Muro until January 1945, scoring 18 total kills throughout the war. An impressive tally, with 39% of those credited to Smith alone. Porter, whose precision and calm under pressure made every intercept possible, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his heroic service. Smith's beloved P-61 flew combat missions until May 1945, surviving the war unscathed despite countless close calls, only to be scrapped along with most Black Widows in the post-war cleanup. Today, only 4 P-61s exist in museums worldwide, none of which are the aircraft that Smith flew that fateful night. McGuire Field, meanwhile, fulfilled its purpose, supporting the January 9, 1945 Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from its runways provided crucial air cover for the landing troops. Engineers later estimated that a single successful Japanese bombing run on the construction sites would have delayed airfield completion by 2 weeks, a setback that would have prolonged the war and cost thousands more American lives. Smith survived World War II, returning to the United States in February 1946, and leaving the military to build a quiet civilian life, never seeking publicity or writing memoirs about his extraordinary exploits. His legacy lives on in dusty military archives, unit histories, and declassified intelligence reports. Dry, factual documentation of a hero's fateful night over Muro. The P-61 Black Widow, meanwhile, proved its worth time and again, dominating night combat from 1944 to 1945, and serving in every theater of the war, from Europe to the Pacific, and across China, Burma, India, and the Mediterranean. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated the F-61, continuing its service until 1954, before being retired and replaced by jet-powered night fighters with superior performance. But on that cold December night over Muro in 1944, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carol Smith was the finest pilot to ever take its controls, turning the tide of battle with courage, skill, and unwavering resolve. If this story moved you, hit the like button to help YouTube share it with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten WWII stories daily. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family served, let's keep these memories alive. Thank you for ensuring Major Carol Smith isn't lost to silence. These heroes deserve to be remembered.